Hi everyone. So just in keeping with the lesson series I have going here concerning Black history, and by the way, all are welcome to listen. I simply started this just because I was inspired by a young lady. If you watch the lesson one, all details is discussed there. So okay, I am going to continue the topic, which is continuing from the last lesson. This is now going to discuss some abolitionists involved during slavery and activists as well. I will begin with Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery, became one of the leading abolitionists of his time. His autobiography, which he revised and republished 3 times, made him extremely popular, but also made him the target of recapture attempts. He traveled the world speaking about evils of slavery and worked with Elizabeth Stanton to promote women's suffrage. He was also the first Black American nominated for Vice President of the United States. Harriet Tubman, an enslaved woman who escaped captivity and went on to lead the Underground Railroad. She helped to free 700 enslaved people and served as the first woman to lead an armed expedition during the Civil War. Now, important abolitionists and activists. Booker T. Washington, an enslaved man who emancipated. Booker T. Washington became one of the most influential leaders of Black liberation. He believed that former slaves should focus more on vocational studies and community building and less on attempts to fight segregation. He became the first president of Tuskegee University and helped to form the National Negro League. In 1895, Booker T. Washington and other Black leaders struck a deal with Southern white leaders. This agreement was never written down or formally recorded. In it, Booker T. Washington and others agreed that Black people in the South would submit to segregation, not ask for the right to vote, nor retaliate against racial violence, or try to end discrimination. In return, they would receive a free basic vocational education, mechanics, teaching, nursing, etc. V.E.B. Du Bois named it the Atlanta Compromise. W.E. Du Bois, a social justice activist, Du Bois helped found the NAACP. He was the first Black American to receive a PhD from Howard University. Du Bois fought against racism and discrimination in education and employment. He actively spoke out against the lynching and Jim Crow laws. He also fought against the idea of genetic superiority of the white race, writing numerous dissenting essays and articles. His collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folks, serves as an example of great intellectual and humanity of Black people. Although he believed in equality for all, he did not speak out in favor of women's voting rights because the leaders of the women's suffrage movement did not actively and publicly support Black rights. Du Bois was against the Atlanta Compromise, believing that Black people should fight for equality and rights. Nat Turner. Born into slavery, Nat Turner led one of the bloodiest revolts against slavery in the United States. He believed that he was chosen by God to fight evil. He led a group of 50 slaves who traveled to different plantations and killed white slave owners, women, and children. His rebellion caused harsher laws against Southern abolitionists, but also garnered the support of Northerners who believed that slavery was wrong. To continue, I will now move on to the South after the Civil War, Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws named for a minstrel routine that degraded Black Americans consisted of any legislation that served to keep segregation intact. These laws, many passed in 1870, required that Blacks and whites remain separated on public transportation, in parks, cemeteries, schools, and theaters. There were separate water fountains, and Black people were often forced to enter buildings through the back door, also known as the servants' entrance. Additionally, there were laws that made interracial marriage illegal. The goal was to prevent interaction between races and to continue the notion that races were not equal. The fight for civil rights came front and center on a broader scale in 1955 when Rosa Parks, a Black woman employed as a secretary at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, refused to give up her seat in the front row of the colored-only section to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. She was arrested for failing to adhere to the city's segregation laws. Sitting was not her first act of protest against this very issue. Nor was Parks the first person to protest in this way. Yet her decision to no longer accept the humiliation of segregation laws sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its spokesperson. Although Rosa Parks' arrest was the catalyst for the boycott, its roots can be traced back to a letter written by the Women's Political Council, WPC, a group of Black women who were civil rights activists and who were already planning a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. The purpose of the Montgomery bus boycott was not to repeal segregation laws, but rather to force the city to hire more Black bus drivers. Its organizers also sought to change the seating policy to one that allowed seats to be filled on a first-come, first-served basis, and to demand to be treated with respect and courtesy. The boycott included 40,000 riders who refused to ride the buses for 381 days. But despite the success of the boycott, it wasn't until Aurelia Broder, Susie McDonald, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith brought a civil lawsuit against the bus company that the boycott elicited positive change. Their case, Broder versus Gale, was used by the Supreme Court to end segregation on buses. The Supreme Court's ruling increased the momentum of the civil rights movement. It was not the first time that the Supreme Court had shot down state-sponsored segregation. The ruling in the case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, which argued by NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall, had overturned segregation and declared that separate but equal schools were inherently unequal. This decision struck down the ruling in Palsy versus Ferguson, 1896, which stated that if the facilities and services offered to Black Americans were equal to those offered to white Americans, segregation was legal. However, since many white people believed Black people were inferior, local governments often ignored the equal portion of Palsy's separate but equal ruling. The ruling in Brown versus Board of Education forced states to integrate their public schools. Between this ruling and that of Broder versus Gale, desegregation was underway. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s unique ability to inspire the public with his speeches made him the face of the movement. His use of non-violent protests, which publicly shamed the very violent police and government officials who tried to suppress the movement, made him hugely popular among Christians. To that end, he was elected president of the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, where he continued to lead and preach about the power of love in moving the nation forward. However, much of the progress made by the movement was due to lesser known activists and organizations. I am going to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And on that note, I will see you for lesson 3. We'll begin with the civil rights era, movements and leaders. Until then, thank you.